Hi, this is Brascheck, and we're recording this on October 2nd, 2020, reading selections of a book called False Alarm: The Truth About the Epidemic of Fear. This was written by Mark Siegel, and it came out in 2005 and was published by John Wiley & Sons. And Siegel was, and I still believe is, an associate professor at NYU School of Medicine, and so he's not a flake. This book is well worth getting, and amazing that none of our intrepid investigative reporters have bothered to read it. Anyway, he reminds us that during the 9/11 hysteria, there was a hysteria about anthrax attacks and chemical attacks, and people were wondering about, is there a way to, seal off a room airtight, so that people could lock themselves inside and be safe. And he points out that carbon dioxide actually is a noxious gas, and maybe terrorists might consider using it, but in an airtight room, the one you described that you intend to build, carbon dioxide would overcome you in a matter of hours, long before terrorists could reach you with sarin gas. And then he goes on to say, if you're concerned about living in a contaminated environment, well, we already live in one. And few of us have chosen to go into a, quote, safe room, unquote, and live out our lives there. Imagine what would happen if we all put our safe rooms together and made a safe world. Not sure what he means there. All right, so he writes there's a chapter in this book called SARS, and it's chapter 10. And you may not be aware, but the current scamdemic is based on SARS, but SARS-2. So this was SARS-1 that happened back in 2003. Let's see. The CDC and World Health Organization used fear to provoke compliance. Okay, so the government sounded its note of preparedness, wanting to seem proactive in another public panic situation where it was usually being reactive. The CDC, which had lost credibility with the anthrax bungle, and it's just funny how we just don't remember how uncredible these people are. But anyway, they rallied publicly with SARS and quarantined entire sections of the planet. It's back in 2003 in response to a virus that's demonstrated 7,000 deaths worldwide. The CDC and World Health Organization used fear to provoke compliance, talking about worst case scenarios and viral mutations, and alarming the whole Western Hemisphere with a few cases that flew around a Toronto hotel. And if you read the other book that we've been recommending, Virus Mania, you'll see that even those cases were dubious at best. Now remember, I'm reading from a book that was published in 2005, 15 years ago. But no one died of SARS in the United States in 2003, and people eventually grew tired of hearing about it. The CDC and the World Health Organization had restricted travel to and from Asia and Toronto based on the assumption that air travel could allow an emerging contagion to spread more easily. The theory was neither proven nor disproven. In fact, historically, isolating an infected patient has always been much more effective than quarantining a region. Let me say that again. This is a book in 2005. Historically, isolating an afflicted patient has always been much more effective than quarantining a region. This principle has held true for plague, influenza, and many other contagious diseases. People, as they panic from an imposed quarantine, can actually spread a bug. It's human nature to run away from perceived risk and human nature to make common mistakes when engaged in overinflated, hypervigilant activity. People who face heavy stigmatization for being a suspected disease carrier are likely to lose their common sense altogether. Nevertheless, when the incidence of SARS died down, as many emerging viruses have done before it, the health organizations were quick to give credit to their worldwide advisory. Now, this is 2005, SARS-1. This is a book, came out, Jay Wiley, not an obscure publisher, written by a physician who worked at a big U.S. medical school. I continue. Back in early 2003, President Bush granted Secretary of Health and Human Services Tommy Thompson the right to quarantine for SARS. So this goes way back to George Bush Jr. Do you remember the films I made about the connection between the Bush family and Tony Fauci? Yeah. So he gave Tommy Thompson the right to quarantine for SARS, thus giving a nudge to the trend that was spreading panic around the globe. And I continue. In more than 50 years of its existence, the World Health Organization had never before issued a travel advisory or enacted a global surveillance network, as they did with SARS. I'm going to repeat that. In the more than 50 years of its existence, the World Health Organization had never before issued a travel advisory or enacted a global surveillance network as it did with SARS. In the United States, meanwhile, the CDC was publicly analyzing every conceivable case. Another unprecedented reaction. Remember, this is a book written in 2005 about something that happened in 2003. SARS was a legitimate concern, but the response was being carried to an extreme. By April, the virus had infected about 2,000 people worldwide and killed fewer than 100, compared to the yearly average influenza death toll of 36,000 in the United States alone. On the surface, a strong public health initiative seemed warranted. As Julie Gerberding, the director of the CDC, pointed out. By the way, Julie Gerberding is the person who rammed the Gardasil vaccine down the throats of Americans and conspired with the pharmaceutical industry to have the vaccination made mandatory in certain states. And when she retired from the CDC, she slipped seamlessly into a multi-million-dollar job contract for Merck, the maker of the Gardasil vaccine. We made videos about that before the coronavirus. Anyway, this Gerberding criminal pointed out in a New England Journal of Medicine article that the cooperation of the international scientific community in identifying the coronavirus, I'm reading a 2005 book here, folks, as the culprit in a matter of weeks was very impressive. My sideline, very suspicious as well. But Gerberding didn't stop with the sciences. She wrote, quote, even more impressive than the speed of scientific discovery in the global SARS outbreak is the almost instantaneous communication and information exchange that has supported every aspect of the response. And I know I keep saying this, I am not reading today's newspaper. I'm reading a book that was published in 2005. But this was problematic, the author goes on. For the most part, the result of all this communication was global panic, an economic shutdown that seemed way out of proportion to the real threat. Yes, the World Health Organization pressure on the Chinese medical authorities to take their heads out of the sand, identify patients, and isolate true cases was impressive, but beyond the historically proven method of isolating infected patients, it was difficult to tell how much air travel and the mobility now available to people and their diseases increased the mandate for regional embargo. This was an issue to be considered, but it wasn't an automatic justification for planet-wide sequestration. Again, he's writing about 2005. The sequestration was pretty limited. It was limited to Chinese people and people who lived in Toronto. And I guess that was the trial run, right? All right, continuing, the CDC appeared to be fully recovered from the public lambasting it had received over the anthrax fraud back in 2001, my word. It had given itself a new face with Gerberding as the new director, giving speeches and press conferences at an unprecedented rate. SARS was a full-fledged international bug du jour with news and media coverage beyond any precedent. This is SARS-1, 2003. The World Health Organization, which had never gotten involved in global tracking strategies to this extent before, was weighing heavily on SARS. In part, this was due to improved technology, greater scientific cooperation, and an increased interest in tracking infectious agents because of concerns over possible bioterrorism. So, SARS happened in 2001. The bioterrorism scare, SARS happened in 2003. The bioterrorism scare was in 2001. And now Siegel, who wrote the book, is being very charitable. He goes, neither organization, was the CDC or the WHO, was really used to the spotlight. He's not exactly right there. Nobody's perfect. They were definitely used to the spotlight. Remember, they got the whole AIDS hysteria pumped pretty good by being in the spotlight. But anyway, and they weren't considering sufficiently how their reactions might be perceived by a fragile public. Well, I think he's wrong there. I think they knew exactly what they were doing. They were hoping to create a panic reaction. There was too much emphasis on public statements and not enough on serological testing and antiviral strategies. Similar to today, right? A whole bunch of hysteria, but testing's a problem, and working on things that work is a problem. SARS needed to be cured with laboratory work, not press conferences. Panic over SARS was public health run amok. All the public posturing took SARS out of its proper context and contributed to a scare that ultimately did more harm than the virus itself. And I'm a broken record, but I just can't say it enough. I'm reading from something that was written in 2005. By focusing only on the worst case scenarios regarding the spread of SARS, the World Health Organization and the Centers for Disease Control were in effect controlling the populace through fear. This helped to spread worldwide economic havoc. Many estimates were that SARS cost over $30 billion to local economies worldwide. Toronto was cut off by the World Health Organization travel advisory through much of April 2003. So back in 2003, this was a $30 billion bill. Now we're looking at a 20 to 30 trillion dollar bill because this is now global. And Toronto was only cut off for a month. They didn't even have a lockdown. They just didn't let people come in and out. We still are locked down in a sense 7 to 8 months later. Chinatowns were deserted in all major cities, and people around the world were stigmatizing anyone who came from an Asian country. In contrast with the rest of Asia, Vietnam's careful and quiet isolating of suspected patients seemed to be behind its success in limiting the spread of the virus. Quarantining hospitals where SARS had spread to healthcare workers, or designing certain centers as SARS hospitals was the upper limit of what seemed reasonable. Monitoring of traffic from countries where SARS had been diagnosed or emphasizing careful precautions in such countries was also reasonable, but was not the same thing as frightening everyone who may have traveled there or who wanted to. With SARS, the propaganda was fear, suggesting that everyone could get it overnight, just like today. This notion had a negative impact on many people. Physician essayist Abraham Verghese, writing for the New York Times Magazine, attacked the transparent political agenda that had been applied to bioterror preparation, but made an invalid assumption that none of this applied to SARS. Certainly restricting movement was necessary with a known killer, but with SARS, people were restricted throughout the spring of 2003 just for having a cough. Many life insurance companies wouldn't grant a policy to a person if he'd been anywhere near Asia in the past month. This was a vast overreaction. The distinction had to be made between the need for global control of a virus before it got out of hand and the political agenda of people wanting to justify their jobs and protect themselves as soothsayers. And here's the big statement. The machinery for public broadcasting that had been set up for bioterror prevention was being used indiscriminately for SARS. I want to read that again. The machinery for public broadcasting, and by public broadcasting we don't mean NPR, we mean all the newspapers, all the magazines, all the television channels, and now all the websites and blogs. The machinery for public, we'll say, communication that had been set up for bioterror prevention was being used indiscriminately for SARS. It was a blind assumption that speaking about SARS incessantly on TV would prevent its spread. The greatest problem with SARS was that once again, public health authorities were talking only in terms of worst-case scenarios while striving to commit massive resources to their agenda. If you approach people where they feel the most vulnerable, as with healthcare and disease, it is easier to sign them up for a program purported to be in their interest. This is exactly what government officials do with bioterror to whip up public support for their anti-terror programs. Make people afraid, make people feel they need you to protect them, and they will allow you a free rein with your agenda. And again, I'm reading from the book False Alarm, The Truth about the Epidemic of Fear by Mark Siegel, MD, Associate Professor at NYU Medical School, published by John Wiley and Sons in 2005. For SARS was the central pathogen. Fear. For SARS, fear was the central pathogen, where the risks of acquiring the new mutated cold virus were far less than the fear of being infected. So your risk of getting this thing was minimal compared to the fear. Uncertainty about the risk really was promoted the panic. Seeing SARS in the news caused us to personalize it. We knew it came from an exotic animal in Asia, but we weren't sure which one, which scared us even further. In reality, SARS, and remember the disease is traveling around right now, is SARS-2, also a coronavirus, was a garden variety respiratory cold virus. Nothing sexy, nothing sinister. It was unsettling to consider that all this attention paid to SARS took attention away from influenza and other proven killers. Worldwide, malaria, dengue, and others were diseases that infected millions each year, for which the protections in place were woefully inadequate. By the way, it looks like, even though Dr. Siegel is very perceptive, he's definitely a Kool-Aid drinker when it comes to HIV equals AIDS, but that's another issue. Meanwhile, here in the United States, panic from SARS replaced panic from bioterror, which replaced panic from West Nile virus. Remember that? If you lived in New York, you can't forget it. They had trucks spraying toxic clouds down the streets at night to kill the West Nile virus. All this reaction represented resources being taken away from the yearly epidemics in order to fight the latest scare. So what do we have here? We have a not obscure guy. He's written books. He's been in the media. In fact, he was even interviewed for the media way back when this thing was first getting started. He's kind of disappeared since. I haven't really seen him on YouTube or in the media. He did do an interview with Alex Jones back in 2007, which he probably regrets. But that's a whole nother story. But anyway, we've been down this road before with the same disease and the same playbook, which is what we've been saying since at least March. And we have to ask how serious we know how serious our public health officials are, their hacks. We know how serious our local politicians are. They're a little too busy to do any independent research. And now we know how serious our, supposedly independent journalists are. They can't even find books that are easily found and read them to get some kind of perspective on what's going on now. And I guess journalists are in the business of recycling today's garbage. I mean, they're not really into thinking or researching or doing any kind of in-depth investigation. They just sort of take what's going on right now and respin it. And that seems to be pretty much what we're getting from just about everybody. On the one hand, we have a whole legion of formerly reputable independent journalists who buy this thing lock, stock, and smoke and barrel. They just believe it. And they're advocates for it, and they're shouting down anybody that asks any questions. That's the majority of independent journalists today. I mean, the Jesse Venturas of the world. I mean, it's really pretty sad. Then you have the people that are in the resistance, but even they're just missing this basic fundamental stuff, which is this. The fundamental thing here is this is a scam. It was conceived as a scam, it's been operated as a scam, and it's going to continue as a scam until we call it a scam. And all the time and energy being spent trying to dispute the misrepresentations and the fraudulent representations of the other side, getting into that minutia, charts and diagrams and statistical analysis. I mean, it's all good, but when a group of people has a track record of being known liars, and they've told a particular set of lies before and caused grave injury, financial and otherwise, to thousands, if not millions of people, you don't get bogged down in answering every one of their claims. You point out that they were been wrong before, they were wrong according to the same pattern, and they're wrong again. But somehow in 2020, that kind of basic intelligence doesn't seem to apply. So anyway, this book is out there. It's well worth reading. If you're a reader, you can order yourself a used copy. They might have new copies, I'm not sure. I'll put a link below. And the book again is False Alarm: The Truth About the Epidemic of Fear by Mark Siegel. And we, just to sum it all up, we've been here before. This should not be a surprise. It certainly shouldn't be a surprise to a public health official or a politician who's interested in public health or a journalist who's covering this story. And yet what I've just read to you in this easily found book published in 2005 might as well be a state secret. And that's Brass Check.